If you'll remember, the last story I was able to share with you was about my work with Dave Clendenin, Noel Snyder, Art Risser, and others in the California Condor Recovery Program. And I have to confess, I'm one of those individuals who likes a little bit of attention. And the Condor program was very rewarding that way. It was a very exciting program. There was a great deal of public attention on it. And in 1993, when I decided to resign from the program, right when we released the first birds back to the wild, I really launched in search of that next exciting program. And I ended up doing some film work with Olivia Newton-John in Costa Rica, leading collecting expeditions in Papua New Guinea, doing transects in Borneo and other places like that. But the real moment came for me in 1995, 2 years after I'd left the Condor program, when I was contacted by a consortium of organizations asking me if I would lead a biological transect across the Maswal Peninsula in northeastern Madagascar. Now, this peninsula was several hundred miles long and about 110, 115 miles across, and was the last and largest stretch of tropical rainforest left in Madagascar. And first of all, Madagascar as a destination, this is incredibly exciting for a biologist. When you stand in a forest, more than 90% of the plants found around you are found nowhere else in the world. There's huge groups of animals like the lemurs that are found nowhere else in the world, or others like chameleons, where there's one or two in Africa and hundreds on this tiny island of Madagascar. So this was just an enormous opportunity to be able to visit such a biological treasure chest of really unique animals. The idea was that we were trying to collect enough data to protect the Maswal Peninsula as a national park. And my job was to do a biological transect where I would walk 100 miles through this forest from one side to the other across a mountain range and out the other side, documenting wildlife and plants and things like that as we went to collect the data we needed to make the argument for a national park. In this particular case, what I was doing is following a butterfly, strangely enough. There is a butterfly on the peninsula that has several different body forms that have evolved over time. Madagascar is a picture of destruction. The rainforests have been wiped out, dry forests wiped out, mining and agriculture have stripped the landscape. And this butterfly has responded to that with several different morphs. So there's actually one morph that lives in very disturbed habitats. There's another morph that lives in secondary habitats, and another that lives in primary forest. And so by tracking this butterfly across the peninsula and looking at the morphs of the butterfly, we were able to evaluate forest health as we went and help make the argument for protecting the peninsula. I headed in. We were supposed to have quite a group. There was supposed to be another entomologist. There was supposed to be an ornithologist, a geographer, and all these folks. For one reason or another, literally everyone fell out except for a photographer and myself. The photographer was a guy named Roy Toft, and I apologize for not being able to share his images tonight. And actually, I have very few of them. Roy is this very talented photographer. And of course, we're talking about the mid-1990s. People were still shooting slides. And as we all know, as climate change comes and impacts us, we've had these crazy fires in California and elsewhere in the United States. Roy kept his slides in a fireproof safe buried under his house, but he lost his home in the '07 fires in Southern California. And we went together to his home to open that safe, and there was nothing but dust in it. So many, many images were lost anyway. So I will try to paint them with words. But it was a fabulous transition into the forest. It's very difficult in the world now to get to true primary forest. And so we went through a lot of battered secondary habitat, rice farming areas and things like that. Finally got high enough and deep enough into the peninsula that we could begin to, for example, drink water from the streams without worrying about human waste and things like that. So it was quite an amazing trek. We got deep enough into the forest that we started coming across tiny communities of people here and there that, while I can't say they were undiscovered cultures, but they were certainly small communities of people that the government didn't know was there. We arrived in one of these communities, and Roy and I are both Caucasian, and the word for us there that they referred to us with was baza, baza. We were always told that baza meant traveler, and I in my research of the word since then, that does indeed appear to be the meaning of the word, but the word baza was never applied to anyone but a white traveler, at least in my experience. So it was a very strange thing to have. But as we got into this one community, they were frightened. It was as though we were ghosts that had come from another community, and they fled into the forest. And it took a long time for us to try to patch things up and rebuild a relationship and get people from the community to come and not be afraid of us. In the process of doing that, the chief of the community insisted that Roy and I sleep in his house that night. As we got over things, and one of the rules we have about travel like this, remote travel, is you never sleep in local housing. Never, ever, ever. You always bring your tent. You always sleep in your own accommodations and take care of yourself, because there's so many body pests and things like that that you can get. But because we had really upset people, we agreed to go into his home. And Roy and I, during that night, were very badly bitten by rats. It was a very long night. I had very long hair at the time, 11 inches more hair than I'm wearing now. And literally the rats would, when I woke up there in the 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a pile of hair that they had chewed off. They'd bit our fingers and that sort of thing. So in the wee hours before anyone was up, we moved back outside to our tent. But the point of that story is to tell you that Roy and I ended up both with very serious staph infections. We didn't know at the time how far away we were, but we were, easily 10 days away from any kind of professional medical care, assuming that we could move quickly. And we didn't really realize how difficult our situation was. We got sicker and sicker, and big infections on our legs and arms. And we continued our trek in search for the other side of the Maswa Peninsula. When we finally got to a point where things were leveling out, and the rivers that we would go by, which had been busy and rushing before, became kind of lazy. The laziness of the rivers indicated that we were on flat lands and maybe approaching the coastline again. So we were very hopeful about that process. And as we came in contact, as we got closer to the Indian coast, we were probably 25 or 30 miles away from the coastline. We went through a small village called Antanambao. And thank you for the effort at pronouncing it before. The words in Madagascar are very complicated. There's a lot of letters, and fortunately, many of them aren't pronounced. But this tiny little village of Antanambao was the home to about 200 people. Roy and I were very sick. They were terrified of us. And as a traditional conservation biologist, I wasn't very impressed by people anyway. So we merely made a note of it in our notes, and we kept going. And I think they were happy that we left, and we really needed some medical attention. We made it to the coast, and we were gathered up and taken out, and all went well. It was about a year later, though, that I got a call from the Malagasy government, and somebody had actually read my notes. That's always a big surprise to me. And they said, "Tell us about this village of Antanambao. We didn't know there were people there. And what do you think? We're thinking we are going to set this aside as a national park. What do we do with those people?" And Madagascar is a terribly poor country. The government is quite corrupt. The vast majority of people live at poverty level or below. This little community of Antanambao, though we spent no time there, we knew they spoke a dialect that was unique to the region. We knew that they had no education, they didn't have running water or electricity, they didn't have any skills to bring to the community. And I was fearful that if they were moved out of the forest, that they would simply disappear. And it was my recommendation to the government that they let them stay in the forest. And the surprising answer came back that they would let them stay if my wife and I would agree to go and live with them and teach them how to live in a national park. Now, on every kind of level, that was a really ridiculous request for them to make. Number one, neither Sonny or I are anthropologists. This isn't what we do. Number two, when it came to sustainable living, these people were living more sustainably than any of us can possibly imagine, and leaving behind a tinier footprint. But the other side of that was it was a really exciting opportunity, and turning it down would have been just terribly, terribly foolish. So I agreed to do that. And my ignorance and naivete shone through on many, many occasions. The first return to Antanambao I did with a young woman named Toone. She was going to be my translator to help us to communicate. And when we arrived in the village, we set up our camp right in the middle of the village. And the chief came out and said, no, Vaza cannot live here. And so we had to pack up and move to the bush, which is not a safe thing to always do. The other thing is that cleanliness is terribly important. And the Ignobe River was rumored to have crocodiles in it. So we went to bathe where they bathed. And again, we're told that Vaza could not bathe there. In any event, we bathed in our own place. And we finally, after a couple of weeks, decided that this was not going to work. We were risking our lives and we were not making any progress with the people there. And so we packed up to go. And as we were doing that, I noticed a little boy hiding in the bushes behind us. He was about 18 months old. I put my hand behind my back and I went, Areke, Arua, Tele, Efeta, Dim. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I did it in Malagasy, I did it in English, and I did it over and over. And I never made eye contact with him because I knew if we looked at each other, he would run like all the other children had. So slowly, after a few minutes, I finally heard him playing back to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After a day, so I told Tina, I said, let's stay, let's see what happens. After a day or two, Emilien brought all of his little friends. Ultimately, their moms came to see where we were. And one day, Tina and I went out to collect butterflies. And when we came back, our camp was gone and it had been moved into the village thanks to this little boy. We spent a great deal of time in that village over the next 3 years, my wife and I, and Emilien accompanied us on everything we did. When he was tiny, he rode on our feet and our hips. As he got bigger, he'd ride on my shoulders and finally walk alongside us. And we really all fell quite in love with each other. We, in a 3-year period, we went from being people that were really feared in this community to developing very deep and loving relationships. And I have to tell you a story that leads up to the last days that we worked in the community. And that is that every afternoon, just before dusk, it would get extraordinarily hot. And the Malagasy, wherever they were, they would just lay down and wait for the heat to pass, for it to get dark. And then they would get up and they would light their cooking fires in the village. Sonny and I always went to our tents to stay safe from whatever was out there. We didn't like just laying out on the ground in the forest. This one night I was very, very ill and we'd had fever and chills. Sonny and I slept in separate tents because it was so hot you couldn't sleep together. And so I went to my tent in the late afternoon. She went to hers. And I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't breathe. I was just stifling inside this tent. So as the dusk was slowly settling, I broke another cardinal rule, much as Roy and I had by sleeping in this man's house. And I unzipped my tent a little bit and I fell asleep with just my nose and my mouth sticking out to get some fresh air from the outside. In my sleep, and in the dark, I felt a tickle on my chin that I assumed would be a mosquito. And the last thing I want was his little plasmodium riddled bite to go into me. So without opening my eyes, I slapped at my face and expecting to just swat away a little mosquito. When I did that, I realized I'd made a huge mistake. Number one, there was something very large and hard in my hand. And number two, when I hit it, it bit me in my chin. And I could tell in a heartbeat that it was a venomous bite. You could feel the heat just shoot out where he'd bitten me from. And I sat up in the dark trying to find out what it was. I couldn't find my flashlight. I was soaking wet. I couldn't tell if I was sweating or bleeding. And in the darkness, I felt whatever this was run up my arm and then down the back of my shirt. I screamed for help, and nobody screams in Antanambao. We would see kids with horrible wounds from machetes and things, but they're so stoic. So my scream alerted the entire village, and everyone rushed over to help me. They pulled me out of the tent. They undid my shirt, and out of my shirt rolled a 9-inch long centipede. It was a centipede that feeds on birds and mice, so it had venom for warm-blooded prey. And everybody really jumped into all kinds of action. The chief's wife, using her little garden-hardened fingers, ripped a big chunk of my flesh out where the bite had been. Tina, my translator, was crying, and people were running, leaving the village. And Tina was not translating for me. I said, Tina, you have to tell me what they're all saying. And through her tears, the only thing she could do is mumble quietly that all they're saying is that you're going to die. And that was kind of a striking moment. Now, obviously, spoiler alert, here I am. I didn't die, made it through that process, but they often get bit on their feet. The venom causes tissue necrosis, and they would get secondary infections from walking in their gardens, and that's what would kill them. So I was able to survive the night and go on to be healthy. And all that story is kind of a prelude to our very last night there. Sonny and I had come back into the village soon enough for the heat wave to hit and for us to go to our individual tents and lay down and rest. And the night came, and slowly the heat abated. And as I said, normally we would wake up, you would look outside and all the cooking fires would be lit, and we would go and help the chief and his wife with cooking of the meals. This time we woke up and the village was dark with the exception of one fire. There was only one fire there, and we didn't know, and there was nobody around. Tina was there. We got Tina and Sonny and I, and we went and we sat next to the only fire, wondering what had happened and where everyone was. And after a few minutes of sitting there, we began to hear singing and rhythmic chanting and pounding from outside in the forest. And we remained next to the fire with darkness all around us. And then we could feel the community of people close in around us, but still out of view, singing to us, thanking us for being there and saying their goodbyes to us. And one person at a time would walk into the circle of fire, into the light next to Sonny and I, and they would hand us a little gift. It might just be a leaf or a clove or a vanilla bean, but each person came in, some of the poorest people in the world coming and giving a goodbye gift to some of the richest people in the world. And it was emotionally exhausting. We cried like you wouldn't believe. And we hugged people who had feared us so badly. We kissed and we hugged and cried all over each other for the whole evening. And because of that, and of course, the most difficult goodbyes were with our little boy, Emilien, and his mom and his dad. And it was an emotion fest that evening. Sonny and I went to our tents and we agreed that we would leave in the morning just right at sunlight so that we would be gone before we had to go through saying goodbyes again to everyone. And so we did. We got up in the dark. We broke down our tents and packed up our bags. And just as light was barely coming to the village, we walked out. And as we got to the perimeter of the village, we were intercepted by Emilien and his mom and dad. And they'd packed a little bag for their son, and they gave him to Sonny and I to take home. We couldn't take Emilien home. That wasn't an option. He was a little boy of the forest and had no birth certificates or anything like that. And even if he had, there was no real justification for us to take someone's child and leave him behind. Because of the difficulties associated with exiting the forest, we needed boats and things set up for us before we got out. Our translator had left the day before, so we couldn't communicate clearly with Emilien or his parents, and all we could do is give them big hugs big kisses, and walk away. And that's what we did. It was very hard to leave him behind, and it got harder, unfortunately. No more than 5 months after we left Madagascar, I heard on the news that an enormous storm was forming over the Indian Ocean cyclone basin, and that it was looking like we'd make landfall at Cap Est. Cap Est was the piece of Madagascar that stuck into the Indian Ocean about 25 miles from our little village. It was going to be the first landfall of the largest storm in history. This was that for more than 100 miles, it had wiped out every structure that existed there, that most of the people in the direct path of the storm had been killed. We had no way of finding out what happened to Emilien and his mom and dad, or any of our other friends, the chief and his wife and the ladies that we'd formed a butterfly farming group. There was just no way to get news. We reached out immediately to all the organizations that had provided funding for us to do our conservation work in Madagascar and told them that we needed funding to go back and to help and to search for people. To an organization, the organization I worked for at the time, the Zoological Society of San Diego, every other major organization, Conservation International, others that had funded our work, the answer was no. You're asking to go help people, and that's not what we do. We do conservation work. We work with animals, and this is not our mission. And it broke my heart. It changed forever how I would look at my history in conservation, how I would look at my future in conservation, and how I would look at my colleagues and friends and everyone else that we had done conservation with, that we could so easily walk away from human tragedies in a situation like this. Sonny and I used our own funds on two occasions to go back to Madagascar and attempt to find Emilien, and we simply were unable to locate him. We got into the forest, we attended funerals, there were many dead, and we found 1 or 2 from the village, but we didn't have a translator to help us. And when we would ask for Emilien, we just got aimed to another funeral. And so it was with that that we came home pretty much heartbroken, both about our personal losses and on a bigger scale about conservation in general. And I needed a break. I took a little bit of a leave, and I looked at conservation, I like to say, from a 30,000 foot altitude, as though I was in a jet or a space rocket looking down at Earth, and tried to look at the really big picture of what was going on and how we might address it. And there are a few things that came to mind. Number one, my agonizing loss for this little boy. That if there was anything that motivated people to do anything on this planet, it was love of family, children, our grandchildren, our sibs, our friends. Those are the things that are truly important to all of us. Many of us have other things that are important, but this was something that was in common with all of us, this love of individuals. The other thing is that those of us who got into conservation, and I'll speak for myself here, I liked handling animals. I liked handling condors or gorillas or baby giraffe and rhinos. That was really fun. But I've come to learn that that isn't going to solve the problems. We can't love our way out of the conservation crisis. The biggest driver of extinction in wildlife is loss of habitat. And the biggest driver of habitat loss is agriculture. If you're a conservation organization and you're not going to talk about agriculture and reducing our footprint for a growing population, you're not really concerned about conservation. At least that's my belief. The other thing is we wanted to look at it from the human side. What is the largest natural killer of human beings? How does it rank with the rest of the things? And what can we do to help people while we help conservation? And that's where we were really stunned. In a world of now 8 billion people, we just hit that landmark, and I don't think that's a good thing. But in a world of 8 billion people, more than 3 billion people still cook in their homes on the floor over an open fire. This open fire is extremely inefficient. So this is 3 billion people cutting trees every year to cook on in a very inefficient manner. In Mexico, for an example, around the monarch butterfly reserves, the average family cuts 20 trees per year to cook and stay warm. When you multiply that out over the 3 billion people on the planet, that gets to be a huge source of forest loss. But it's also the #1 killer of people. Indoor cooking smoke, the effects of indoor cooking smoke, kills more people every year than AIDS, breast cancer, malaria, or dirty drinking water combined. It is the largest single killer of human beings in the world. So knowing those things, knowing what we knew about agriculture, about stoves, about human lives, and now with the biggest driver of climate change shifting away from agriculture by climate through the effects of climate change, which is still largely driven by agriculture, we had really redefined in our minds how to look at conservation and what might really make a difference. So we set about looking for ways to reduce our agricultural footprints, to find ways to save human lives and protect wildlife resources at the same time. These communities, if you think about open space in the world, endangered habitats, more than 90% of all endangered habitats are owned by indigenous people. And those are some of the most underserved people in the world. And without taking care of them, we can't expect to take care of these valuable habitats. So we settled on two things. We ultimately left our job with the Zoological Society of San Diego. We launched an organization called Eco-Life Conservation, and we did two things, and two things only, but two things that we believe have huge, huge impacts. First of all, we do sustainable agriculture. We have focused on a form of agriculture called aquaponics, where fish and plants are raised in a closed circuit system. It's extraordinarily efficient. In the state of California, we grow a tremendous amount of lettuce, and every head of lettuce costs us about 12 gallons of water. This is a state that ran out of water more than 100 years ago. And we produce more lettuce than any country in the world other than China. So we're exporting a huge amount of water that we don't have. With aquaponics, we can reduce that water use by 90%. We can cut our growing time by 1/3 and our land space use by 90%. It's extraordinarily efficient. Imagine an acre foot of water taller than Mount Everest. Those are the kinds of savings that we could bring by shifting our agriculture over to more efficient systems in this state. In Mexico, where the monarch butterflies live, and in Uganda, where the mountain gorillas are, we're in those communities building fuel-efficient stoves that reduce their wood cutting by 60%, that takes all the smoke out of their homes, creates jobs, and creates a safe environment for children to grow up in. I'm very proud of the fact that we just finished our 11,500th stove in Mexico. That means that those 11,000 stoves every year per stove are offsetting 3 tons of carbon from our climate. Every single stove is saving 12 trees per year, and every single stove is improving the quality of life for at least 5 people. And better yet, now, thanks to carbon offsets, we're able to market the carbon savings from those stoves and make sure that a family who gets a stove has it for the rest of their family's life. That stove will always be there. We will be able to maintain and replace it and save those trees and those climate offsets year after year. Sunny and I did this work for a very long time, 16 years of working on it. And after 16 years, we had built a very strong donor base. And now I want to take us for a moment back to Madagascar. After 16 years, 3 of our biggest donors pulled me aside and said, "We've all heard your story of Emilien and the things that happened, and we would like to fund your return to Madagascar to find out once and for all what had happened to your little boy." And I will send to you a link to a little video about this so you can have some images to put with the story. But I agreed immediately to go back to Madagascar and search for Emilien, and that turned out to be a really dumb idea. After 16 years, all of the infrastructure that had been there that allowed me to get that deep into the forest and that remote was gone. The organizations we had worked for out of Antanambao, the capital city, they had dissolved. People had gone on to universities in other countries, and we really didn't have a connection. But I had agreed to go back, and I now had a budget to go back. And the budget was this. The budget was, don't come home until you have an answer. And while you're there, get whatever you need to solve it. So I was able to finally find Tina, our translator that we had used 16 years earlier. She'd gone on to other work, but through a long and rigorous search on Google, I was able to find her again. And she agreed to make some connections for us so we could go back. So we flew back to Madagascar and began a journey that would take us more than a month of exploring back into the Maswal Peninsula. There is something very true and honest about the word bushfind. When you are in a remote area like that, if you will talk to people as you go and tell them why you're there, your story will precede you. It will get ahead, it will travel faster than you're able to walk. And so as we were searching and working our way towards where Antanambao had once been, every time we ran into someone in the bush, we shared our story of who we were looking for and why. And my hope is that once we found the Ignobe River again, and we would have to travel up it by several miles, well, lots of miles, tens of miles by pirogue. My hope is that if we went by an area where the people of Antanambao had settled, that there would be people along the shore to greet us and to welcome us back. Sadly, as we went up the Ignobe River, that didn't happen. We drew closer and closer to where the village of Antanambao had been. And even after 16 years, we could tell it was gone. The forest was still flattened. There was nothing there. The village had sat right along the river's edge. We pulled into that area. There was a tiny handful of people there, but a disappointing number. We knew it couldn't possibly be for us. And these pirogues are very difficult, at least for Vaza to travel in. They're very unsteady in the water. If you move, they're just a dugout canoe is what it is. And if I shift my weight, the person pulling the boat would shift to counter me, and that would magnify in my mind what I was doing. And so I would be in this constant weight battle with the person trying to control the pirogue. And I was very capable of dumping us out. We slid into the shore and tried to stabilize the boat in the sand. And I went to get up to get out and was unsteady. And as I got out of the boat, a young man took my hand and helped me from the boat. And when I turned, because he didn't let go of my hand, there was Emilien, our little boy now in his early 20s. He was a handsome young man. He had survived the cyclone. The village of Antanambao had moved quite a ways away, but true to the bushfind, they had heard that we were coming, and the village had decided that they would just send Emilien and his mom and dad to meet us at the river. So they were the only ones there. They led us slowly back to the village. In the village, many people had left after the storm. They moved to other villages or married and had other relationships. But because in this month in the bush, they'd heard that we were coming, so many people who had moved elsewhere came back to the village of Antanambao to be there to greet us, to cook for us, and to celebrate. We returned to that community very different from, we'd approached it as strangers. We'd become friends. And on this trip, this return and reunion with Emilien and his family, we became family to this community. We were welcomed into their homes like we had never been before. It was very, very moving. While we were there was a huge surprise for us, and it was that Emilien now was the father of a little baby girl about exactly the same age as Emilien was when we first met him. And we wanted to take pictures of Emilien, his girlfriend, his little boy. And as we did, we realized that we were sitting in the very same villages we'd worked in for 16 years prior to that, little houses just packed with smoke. The health impacts of these fires is the equivalent of smoking 400 cigarettes a day. And there was Emilien, his girlfriend, and his newborn little girl, whose lungs would be filled with this smoke right from day one. And at that moment, we realized that not only had we gone back to Madagascar and found Emilien, but what we had found was ratification of our mission. And the fact that conservation, if it's really going to work, has to involve people with positive rewards for each and every one of us in health and in well-being. Because in fact, every bit of wealth that we enjoy, the health we enjoy, is all based on the resources around us. And so we have, with that rediscovery and with that ratification, we have continued our work with a fever around the world. And I invite you to visit the website ecolifeconservation.org, or if you get a chance, go on to Amazon.com and pick up the book On the Wings of the Condor and hear our story from that. With that, it looks like I've burned through our time, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take some questions if you still have them.
So I'm not sure, it might be best if people type them into the chat because I can't see everybody raising their hand. So if you have questions, type it into the chat and I'll read them off to Bill. But, I want to say, Bill, that is a really quite remarkable story. You're a very good storyteller, which is fantastic. I mean, I was really struck about entering the primary forest too. I don't know what was left of the primary forest when you went back, if you got into primary forest, but I've had the privilege once of working in primary forest in Northern California, and it is unlike anything I've ever seen before and since. I mean, massive giants that oftentimes didn't have tops, but it was pretty remarkable to see places that have never been logged out.
Yeah, it really is very remarkable. And sadly, on our return, there was no primary forest, at least in the eastern half of the peninsula that we were on. It had been wiped out first by the storm. And of course, with a corrupt government and poor infrastructure, then immediately valuable timbers started to be taken out. And so much of what it was there in the 90s is now gone.
Yeah. I worked in Guatemala in the 70s, rebuilding after the earthquake, and the issue of smoke in the houses was huge. They were cooking in cornstalk houses to allow enough air to move through. And what the houses we were building, although there were some major problems with them, every single one included a stove with a chimney, so that would know it was more efficient and it would no longer pollute the inside of the house.
It's just an astronomical health crisis. I think one of the things for us to keep in mind as we listen to the outcomes of the climate summits and failures of addressing this issue is that if you provided each of these families that needs a stove, it would be the climate equivalent of removing every car and truck from the roads in the United States and Europe.
Wow. So I'm starting to get some questions come in, Bill. So I'm gonna be asking those.
Sure.
Bert Townsend wanted to know if you had any flora or fauna pictures to share. And I don't know, Bert, if you were here when Bill said that his slide program was not working. Maybe there's a website, perhaps, that you have.
I will forward you 2 links that are to videos that we shot during our time in Madagascar that I think will bring a lot of this to life for you.
Excellent.
I'll send a link to you and you can distribute it to the group.
Thank you. Good. So William wants to know, how does your stove actually work? What are the components in it and how are they built? And
great question. There's 5 things. So one of the things I believe I've learned and taken away is that there are a lot of organizations doing great conservation research and data collection. And Ecolife vowed not to be one of those, but to depend on those organizations that create that data. So we don't design our own stoves. What we did is we set 5 criteria for what a stove needed to be. And those criteria are, number 1, that it has to be permanent. It has to be a stove that can't be moved. And the reason for that is, number 1, it allows us to track it and to make sure that our investment is being used. The second reason it's important is the second criteria for our stoves, and that is that they all must have a chimney that takes smoke outside of the home. The third requirement is that they have to have cool sides and be safe for children. I can't tell you how many horrific burns I've seen on children. And Aman was helping his mother in their kitchen. They had a huge pot on a 3-stone fire, and he was stirring it and tipped the boiling pot over. It poured out and blew fire and boiling water onto his groin and his belly. He will go through the rest of his life with his mom's handprint on his belly where she pulled him out of this burning mess. So it's very important to us that these stoves be very safe for kids. Fourth, they have to be they have to use 60% less fuel than what people are using now. And the reason we don't change fuel relates to our fifth and final reason, and that is that the stoves have to be culturally appropriate. People cook in certain ways in different cultures. They look for certain flavors. If you provide them with a gas or propane stove, that flavor is going to go away. They have to spend money on gas and propane, and the combination of not getting the flavors they want and having to spend money makes it so that they will not use it. We have more than a 95% adoption rate out of 11,500 stoves, which is just unheard of, but it's because we've adopted a stove that was culturally appropriate and that people really wanted to use. In Mexico, it's good for fire at the front with a big comal or cooktop on it for the big tortillas. There's 2 more burners on the back of the stove, but those burners are heated entirely with smoke from the fire. And that's on those back burners, using only smoke, you can boil water. And then the chimney has a water tank on it so that they get hot water from the smoke going up the chimney. So anyway, the stove has to be permanent, has to have a chimney, 50% fuel reduction, safe for 60% reduction, safe for children, and that it has to be culturally appropriate. And if a stove meets those criteria, we will provide it.
That is fantastic. I mean, that is the list of things that it needs to be. You need to solve more than one problem at a time. Very interesting. Okay,
this is what we're shooting for is we're shooting for a holistic solution that works for the most number of people and our environment.
So do you find that you're designing different stoves or finding different stove designs for different cultures?
Very much so. For an example, the area we work in Mexico, the big flour tortilla is such an essential part of their dining. In Uganda, because of 3-stone fires for generations, their cooking pots are round bottom pots, and they mostly are eating stews and things and small breads. So we actually have to make a ring top stove that'll take a round bottom pot so that it's as familiar to them as possible. So, and it has to be a different size. The Purepecha and Masawa people in Mexico, as poor as they are, have larger homes than the Batwa and Bachiga people in Uganda. So if we moved a Patsari stove into a Batwa home in Uganda, there'd be no room left for people. So it really has to be designed to fit the culture. So they're all very different.
Interesting. So Linda Barker says, that is an incredible story, and she thanks you for sharing. Were the lessons from Emilien about the importance of working with people, impacts of agricultural and conservation habitat, and anything else?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. It was, I think all of us, we get used to how we do things in life. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Condor program was very emotionally rewarding for me because of the attention we got. And so were so many of the other programs we did. And I would have never re-examined what I did without the pain of loss, without believing I'd lost a little boy that was very, very dear to me. And so simply that accident caused life. And I think, hopefully without such tragedy, to just sit back, take a break from everyday life and re-examine what we're doing and whether or not it's the thing we should be doing. So the message from Emilien was that I needed to rethink it. The endorsement was when we went back and I saw the damage from agriculture and his little girl in a smoke-filled hut. and knew then that at least for me and for Sunny and I, we were doing the best thing we could do for the world and for the people we love.
Wow. There's a question from someone about what you were eating on your trips. Did you bring some of your own food? Were you eating what the villagers were eating? And what were the villagers eating?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I usually bring it up. In Antanambao, you eat nothing but rice, white rice, and you eat it 3 meals a day, and you drink a drink called ranamapang. They have a belief system in this part of Madagascar called fadi, and they believe that, so fadi is a word that kind of describes bad luck, and so they believe it's fadi, for example, to drink cold water. They know that if you drink cold water, you will have very bad luck, you'll get very sick, but they don't know why. They just know if they drink hot water, it doesn't happen. So they drink a hot water called ranamapang, which is a rice tea, and you eat the rice that's cooked in that 3 times a day. And your value as a worker and a human being is determined by how much rice you can eat. And they were very proud of me when, after several years, I finally was able to eat 2 bowls of white rice at one setting. The only addition to it would often be a brown, lightly spicy, crusty material that would be broken up over the top, which I absolutely loved until I learned that they were collecting maggots from rotting carcasses, drying them out and sprinkling it on the rice for protein. So it was rice, maggots, and ranamapang.
Interesting. So did you bring your own food?
No, it was too hard to carry anything. And we would go in for 6 weeks or 8 weeks at a time. So you couldn't carry water or food with you. It was just too much weight. So we always depended on what they had.
So Norm Pillsbury is asking you to tell the story about leaving a phone with Emilien and the next cyclone.
Oh, wow. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so I'll tell you what, and this is a tribute to all the women out there. We men are very lucky to have you. And we don't always understand, but as we all learn as we get older, you're always right. So when Sunny and I went back, and it's funny, this week it has actually even struck me very profoundly. As we worked up and down the coast of California on Highway 1 doing our book signings, there's so much of the coast of California where there's no cell signal at all. We couldn't get emails or phone calls or do anything like that. Strangely enough, when we found Emilien's village again, Sunny noted that we actually had cell signal there, that there was somewhere around there was a tower, and we were actually able to get a signal that far out. So we took Emilien with us back to the town of Antala. The idea was to get him a birth certificate in case it would come about that we actually would bring him to the United States one day for a visit. So when we went there, Sunny slipped away one afternoon and she bought Emilien a cell phone and a little solar charger. And my response to that was about the stupidest thing I could have imagined her doing. But that's a man for you. So she gave Emilien this cell phone and a little solar charger, and he was absolutely thrilled. And we left, and bizarrely enough, we had found Emilien in roughly the same month that we had left him 16 years earlier. And it was literally several months later that another storm formed. It came across on the news as being headed to the same place. Because Sunny had left that phone there, we were able to contact Artis, the young man who had helped us with translating in Antala. He was able to call Emilien, and they were all able to run to high ground before the storm hit. The village was completely wiped out, but no lives were lost. And in addition to that, thanks to a really powerful group of lovely donors, we had more than 5,000 pounds of food delivered to the village before any international aid groups had even landed in the capital city.
Good story. Blessings to Sunny for that.
Absolutely.
So the last question I have is Linda Barker, who had worked as a Peace Corps volunteer in Rwanda in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were doing fired clay stoves, but there was also a lot of charcoal making in the big kilns, which concerned her from an environmental standpoint. She'd like your opinion on
Yeah.
charcoal kilns.
Yeah. The use of charcoal is, of course, 10 times worse than the use of wood, because they're taking a huge amount of wood and burning it down to create charcoal. So it's really terrible. At the moment, though, again, it's one of these cultural things where you're going to have a really tough time getting people off of charcoal. And so our goal, again, is to find more efficient ways both to make charcoal and for the stoves they use to be more efficient in how they burn it so that they use much less. But yeah, charcoal, for the communities that use charcoal, it is our arch nemesis. It is the absolute worst. It's 10 times worse than using fuel wood.
Yeah.
She's absolutely right.
So that's the end of the questions. Linda's last comment to you, though, is she too found that the very poorest people in Eastern Africa were among the most generous. I think all of us who have worked in areas with very poor people have discovered that same lesson.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting me be part of your evening. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I'm really happy we were able to do this. And I will send you some links to try to make up for it.